I didn't steal anything. The words cracked through the store like glass under pressure as the mops slipped from Evelyn Carter's hands and clattered across the tile, the sound echoing too loudly in a place that suddenly felt too quiet, too controlled, like every breath had to ask permission before existing. Marcus Reed stood near the entrance in a worn gray uniform, a name tag that wasn't his, watching from a distance of maybe 12 feet as two security guards hovered just close enough to make Evelyn looked smaller than she already was, her shoulders curled inward, her fingers trembling against the edge of a cleaning cart that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a dull rhythm, casting pale reflections across the polished floor she had just spent the last hour scrubbing, reflections that now caught the shine of tears she was trying, and failing, to hide. "You were the only one back here," Daniel Brooks said, his voice calm in a way that didn't feel calm at all. More like something practiced, something sharpened over time, his crisp white shirt untouched by the dust and effort that clung to everyone else, his eyes never quite meeting hers, only looking at her, like she was part of the inventory. A single sheet of paper rested on the counter beside him, angled just enough to feel like a trap already sprung. "Sign it," he added, tapping the edge lightly, the sound soft but final. "And we can make this simple." No one moved, not the cashier pretending to reorganize receipts, not the stock boy frozen halfway through lifting a box, not even the hum of the refrigeration units seemed as loud anymore. Marcus's gaze shifted slowly, not to the manager, not yet, but to the far corner above the storage hallway where a security camera hung dark, inactive, its tiny red light missing, like an eye deliberately closed at the wrong moment. Something in his chest tightened, not sudden, not explosive, but steady, controlled, like pressure building behind a sealed door. Evelyn shook her head faintly, barely noticeable, her voice dropping to almost nothing. "I've worked here 6 years. I wouldn't..." But the sentence didn't finish, it just faded into the air. Like it had nowhere safe to land. Daniel didn't respond, just slid the paper a few inches closer to her, the scrape against the counter louder than it should have been. "Then prove it doesn't have to get worse," he said. Marcus took one step forward, slow enough not to draw attention, but deliberate enough that the distance between him and the truth felt smaller, his eyes flicking once more to the dead camera, then back to Evelyn's shaking hands, and something in the silence shifted, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm decides it's no longer going to wait. The silence did not break, it thickened, pressing down on every surface until even the air felt heavy to breathe. And Marcus could see it in the way Evelyn's shoulders sank just half an inch lower, like something inside her was quietly giving up. Her hands hovered above the paper but never touched it, fingers curled slightly as if even the act of reaching would confirm something she knew was not true. The cart beside her rattled softly when one wheel shifted, the only movement in a room that had decided to stay still. Marcus took another step, slow, measured, his boots making a soft rubber sound against the polished tile, and for a moment no one noticed him except the older cashier near the register, whose eyes flicked up briefly before dropping back down, as if looking too long might pull her into something she did not want to be part of. Daniel Brooks finally turned his head, just enough to acknowledge the movement, his expression tightening with mild irritation. "You are new, right?" he said, his tone flat, already dismissive. "This does not concern you." But Marcus did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting past Daniel toward the back hallway where the storage room door stood slightly open, a thin strip of darkness cutting through the bright store like a hidden seam. Something about that door, the way it was left not fully closed, felt deliberate, like a detail meant to go unnoticed. Evelyn's voice came again, softer now, almost lost. "Please! I need this job." And the words did not sound like a defense, they sounded like a plea to be seen, to be understood beyond the accusation hanging in the air. Daniel exhaled through his nose, controlled and patient, tapping the paper again with 2 fingers. "Then help yourself by cooperating," he said, and there was something in the phrasing that made it clear the outcome had already been decided. Marcus's eyes moved once more, back to the ceiling, to the dark camera, then to the small monitor mounted behind the counter, its screen showing other angles of the store, bright, active, every aisle visible except the one leading to the storage hallway. a blank square where footage should have been. The absence was louder than any evidence. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to confirm what he already suspected, and a quiet certainty settled into his posture. He stepped closer now, closing the remaining distance until he stood just a few feet from Evelyn, close enough to hear the uneven rhythm of her breathing. Close enough to see the faint crease in her uniform where her name badge had been pinned for years. "What exactly is missing?" Marcus asked finally, his voice calm, steady, cutting clean through the tension without raising in volume. Daniel's eyes narrowed, not expecting the question. "Inventory discrepancy," he replied after a beat, vague, controlled. "Items from the back." And Marcus nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer, though his gaze shifted again toward the open door, the missing footage, the quiet fear in Evelyn's eyes that did not match guilt but something deeper, something closer to being cornered. The lights above flickered once more, briefly dimming, and in that split second of shadow, the truth felt closer than before, just out of reach but no longer hidden well enough to stay buried. Daniel did not like the question, that much was clear in the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction most people would miss, but Marcus did not after years of reading rooms where millions of dollars could shift on a single hesitation. "It is not your responsibility to ask," Daniel replied, his voice cooler now, less patient, as if the situation had drifted off script, and for the first time the control he held over the room showed a faint crack. Marcus nodded once, slow, almost respectful, but his eyes did not leave the manager's face. "I am trying to understand," he said, calm, measured, the kind of tone that did not challenge directly but refused to step back. Evelyn remained still between them, her presence almost forgotten by everyone except Marcus, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed somewhere near the floor as if looking up might make things worse. The paper on the counter had not moved, but it felt heavier now, like it carried more than words, like it carried an outcome already decided without her. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, just enough to change his angle, and from where he stood he could now see a small detail near the edge of the counter, a printed report partially tucked beneath a clipboard, numbers and item codes visible for just a second before Daniel's hand moved casually to cover it. Too quickly, too precisely. That was not instinct, that was awareness. Marcus's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, long enough to register a mismatch between what was written there and what had just been said, then returned to Daniel, who now held his posture tighter, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, performing authority rather than simply having it. "Inventory from the back," Marcus repeated quietly, as if confirming, and Daniel gave a short nod. "Correct," he said, but the word landed flatter this time. Marcus let a brief silence sit between them, not empty, but intentional, the kind that made people fill it if they were uncertain. Somewhere near the front of the store, a customer pushed a cart, the wheels squeaking faintly, a reminder that the world outside this moment was still moving, still normal, while inside this space something was clearly not. Marcus's eyes moved again, tracing the path from the open storage door to the counter, then to the inactive camera, connecting pieces that did not align the way they should. He stepped one pace closer to the counter. Not aggressive, not rushed, but enough to shift the balance, enough that Daniel had to adjust his stance by half an inch. "Then we should be able to verify that," Marcus said, his voice steady, almost casual, but the words carried weight, the kind that turned observation into intention. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly before he responded. "It has already been reviewed," he said, and this time there was a slight edge, a hint of defensiveness that had not been there before. Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer, but his eyes drifted once more to the blank monitor feed, the missing footage that should have been there if everything was as simple as it was being presented. Evelyn's fingers curled tighter at her sides, and for the first time she glanced up, not at Daniel, but at Marcus, a flicker of something in her expression, not hope yet, but recognition that someone had noticed the part everyone else was ignoring. The lights above hummed softly, steady again now, but the room did not return to normal. It held that tension, stretched thin, like something unseen was about to surface whether anyone was ready or not. Daniel's expression held for a moment longer, but something behind it shifted, subtle and quick, like a door closing just before it could be seen. "There is nothing to verify," he said, each word placed carefully, but now there was a tightness in his tone that had not been there before, and Marcus noticed it immediately. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer passive silence. It was the kind that leaned in, waiting, even if no one admitted it. Marcus let his gaze drift once more, not rushed, not forced, moving from the counter to the floor, following faint streaks left by the mop, then toward the storage hallway where the door still stood slightly open, the narrow gap unchanged, as if it had been left that way on purpose. "Then it should not be a problem to take a look," Marcus said, calm, almost conversational, but the weight behind the words pressed into the space between them. Daniel gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any warmth. "We are not conducting a tour," he replied, stepping slightly to the side, positioning himself just enough to block a direct path to the hallway. The movement was small, but it said everything Marcus needed. Evelyn shifted faintly behind him, the soft sound of fabric brushing against fabric, and Marcus could feel her hesitation without turning around, could sense the way she was caught between fear and the fragile possibility that this moment might change something. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the lights. "It is okay, I can just sign and go." And the words landed heavier than anything else in the room, not because they solved anything, but because they showed how long she had been standing alone before this. Marcus's jaw tightened just slightly, not visible to most, but enough to settle something in him. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes for the first time, and there was no pressure in his look, no demand, just a steady presence that did not move away. "You do not have to do that," he said, low and even, and for a second Evelyn's expression faltered, like she did not recognize what that sounded like anymore. Daniel's patience thinned visibly now. "This is not your decision to make," he cut in, sharper this time, stepping forward half a step, closing space that had not been his to close. Marcus turned back slowly, his posture still relaxed, but grounded now, unmoved by the shift in tone. "You are right," he said, and Daniel seemed to take that as agreement for a brief second, until Marcus continued. "It is not mine, and it is not hers either, if the process is not clear." The words landed without force, but they did not yield. A faint murmur moved somewhere near the registers, quickly silenced, but enough to show that others were listening more closely now. Marcus's eyes lifted once more to the blank camera, then back to Daniel, holding the connection a second longer than before. "If the footage is missing," he added quietly, "then the explanation should be stronger, not weaker." And that was the moment something changed completely. Daniel's composure slipped, not dramatically, but enough that the confidence no longer looked natural, it looked maintained, the lights above steadied, the hum returning to its usual rhythm, but the room did not follow, it stayed suspended, balanced on the edge of something that had not yet been spoken out loud, but was already beginning to show itself in every small detail no one could ignore anymore. The air shifted again, but this time it did not feel uncertain, it felt fragile, like something already cracked and only waiting for the final pressure to break. Daniel's eyes flicked once toward the storage hallway before returning to Marcus, too quick for most to notice, but not for him, not anymore. Marcus followed that glance without moving his head, mapping the room in silence, the angle of the counter, the position of the door, the blind spot where the camera feed had gone dark, and suddenly the pieces no longer felt disconnected, they felt arranged. "You said it was reviewed?" Marcus said quietly, his tone unchanged, but the words landed heavier now, not as a question, but as a line being drawn. Daniel straightened, forcing his shoulders back, reclaiming posture that had started to slip. "It was," he answered, sharper this time, but the certainty did not carry as far as before. Marcus nodded once, then let his gaze drop briefly to the floor again, to the faint tracks left by Evelyn's mop, overlapping patterns that led toward the hallway and back, repeating, consistent, except for one section near the threshold where the streaks broke, interrupted, as if something had been moved across the surface before she had finished cleaning. It was small, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it, and Marcus was. He took a slow step toward that direction, not enough to provoke but enough to shift attention, and Daniel noticed immediately, his body turning just slightly to follow, blocking without appearing to block. That was enough. Evelyn's voice came again, quieter than before. "I clean that area last, every night," she said, almost to herself, but Marcus heard it, and it settled into place with everything else. He paused, then looked back at her, just long enough to acknowledge what she had said, then returned his focus forward. "Then something happened after," he said, not accusing, not loud, just stating what the room was already beginning to understand. A faint stir moved through the staff again, quickly suppressed, but present. Daniel's expression tightened further. "You are making assumptions," he replied, and now the edge was clear. No longer hidden behind calm professionalism, Marcus exhaled slowly, steady, his posture still relaxed, but grounded in a way that did not shift anymore. "No," he said, just one word, simple, but it landed with more weight than anything else so far. "I am following what is missing." And as he said it, his eyes lifted once more to the blank camera, then to the monitor, then to the paper on the counter that Daniel still guarded too closely. The pattern was complete now, not proven, not yet, but visible enough that it could not be unseen. The lights above held steady, no longer flickering, but the room did not calm. It held that tension, stretched thinner than before, like a thread about to give way. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of it all, her hands no longer reaching for the paper, her breathing still uneven, but something had shifted in her eyes, something small but undeniable, the beginning of doubt not in herself, but in what she was being told. Marcus took one final step closer to the counter, stopping just short of crossing into Daniel's space, his presence quiet but immovable, and in that moment, without raising his voice, without forcing anything, he made it clear that the story in this room was no longer going to follow the path it had been set on. The room did not move, but everything inside it seemed to hold its breath at once, like even the smallest sound might tip something over. Marcus stood still now, no longer stepping forward, no longer adjusting, just present, his eyes steady on the details no one else wanted to look at, the broken pattern on the floor, the open door, the silent camera, the paper that had not been signed. Daniel shifted his weight again, subtle, but not subtle enough, his hand resting flat against the counter as if anchoring himself, as if control could be held through contact alone. The hum of the overhead lights deepened, a low constant sound that filled the silence between them, and for a moment it felt louder than any voice in the room. Evelyn's fingers loosened slightly at her sides, no longer curled inward as tightly, her gaze lifting just a fraction, not fully, but enough to see Marcus more clearly, enough to realize he had not stepped away like the others had over the years. "This is unnecessary," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter now, controlled again, but the sharpness had dulled into something more cautious, more aware. "We have procedures for this." And the word procedures lingered, meant to restore order, meant to remind everyone of structure, but it did not land the same way anymore. Marcus did not respond right away, letting the word sit in the air, letting it echo against everything that had already been seen. He turned his head slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the monitor behind the counter, the one showing every active camera feed except the one that mattered, the blank square still empty, still silent, like a missing piece no one could replace with explanation. He stepped toward it slowly, not crossing into any restricted space, just close enough to study it. His reflection faintly visible in the dark portion of the screen, layered over absence. "Procedures depend on complete information," he said quietly, almost to himself, but clear enough for the room to hear. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched longer than it should have, long enough that the cashier near the register glanced up again, long enough that even the security guards shifted slightly, unsure where to place their attention now. Marcus reached out, not touching anything, just hovering his hand near the edge of the monitor, tracing the boundary between what was visible and what was not, then lowering it again. "And this is not complete," he added, and the statement did not accuse, it revealed. Evelyn swallowed softly, the sound almost lost, but present, her eyes moving from Marcus to the blank screen, and for the first time she looked not confused, not afraid, but searching, like she was beginning to see the same gap he had been following from the start. Daniel's posture stiffened again, but this time it did not expand, it contained, like he was holding something in rather than projecting outward. "You are overstepping," he said, but the authority in his voice no longer filled the space the way it had before. Marcus turned back slowly, meeting his gaze fully now, not challenging, not aggressive, but unyielding in a way that did not need volume. "Then help me understand," Marcus said, calm, steady, giving the room one more chance to align with the truth instead of avoiding it. The lights held steady above them, the hum constant, but the silence beneath it had changed completely, no longer passive, no longer controlled, but waiting, as if something unseen had already surfaced and was simply deciding when to be fully recognized. The silence stretched until it no longer felt empty but exposed, like every hidden piece in the room had been quietly placed under a light no one could turn off. Daniel's eyes held on Marcus for a second too long, then shifted away, not fully, just enough to break the direct line, and that small movement said more than any explanation he had given so far. Marcus did not follow the glance this time, he stayed still, letting the space settle, letting the weight of what had already been revealed do its work. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, and pulled out a small, worn phone, the kind that did not draw attention on its own. The motion caught a few eyes in the room, subtle shifts of awareness, but no one spoke. Marcus tapped the screen once, twice, his gaze never leaving Daniel's face, and then turned the phone outward, angling it just enough for the manager to see. "The system logs," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, almost level with the hum of the lights. "They track every camera status change, even when the feed is off." And the words landed with precision, not loud, but exact. Daniel's posture locked, not outwardly, but in the stillness that followed, like something inside him had stopped adjusting. Marcus took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough that the screen between them became impossible to ignore. "This one," he continued, tapping lightly, "was manually disabled at 6:42 p.m. His eyes flicked once toward the hallway, then back. "After closing prep began, but before final inventory was logged." And now the pattern was no longer implied, it was visible. A faint sound moved through the room, not quite a reaction, more like the quiet release of breath people had been holding without realizing it. Evelyn's hand lifted slightly, not toward the paper, but toward her chest, as if steadying herself, her eyes moving between Marcus and the screen, trying to catch up to what was unfolding in front of her. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped, the first real break in his control, brief but undeniable. "That does not prove anything," he said finally, but the sentence lacked structure, lacked the confidence it needed to stand. Marcus did not argue, did not push, he simply let the phone lower slightly, then added, "It proves the camera was turned off." A pause, measured. "And it proves it was not her." And with that, the room shifted completely. The accusation that had been resting on Evelyn began to lose its shape, no longer solid, no longer supported by the space around it. The paper on the counter looked smaller now, less like authority and more like something unfinished. Daniel's shoulders drew in just slightly, not collapsing, but no longer expanded, no longer certain. Marcus held his position, not advancing further, not needing to, because the truth was no longer something he was chasing, it was something already standing in the room, waiting to be acknowledged. The lights above remained steady, the hum unchanged, but beneath it the silence transformed into something else entirely, not tension, not fear, but realization. Quiet and irreversible, settling into every corner of the space where denial had been only moments before. The truth did not explode into the room, it settled, heavy and undeniable, pressing into every surface until no one could pretend it was not there. Daniel stood still behind the counter, but the structure of his authority had already shifted, no longer supported by certainty, only by what he could still say before silence answered for him. "System logs can be misread," he said finally, but the words felt thinner now, stretched across a gap they could not fully cover. Marcus did not react to the explanation, he simply watched, calm, steady, as if giving Daniel space to hear himself. Then Marcus reached up slowly, his hand moving to the edge of his collar, and for the first time since he stepped into the store, something about him changed, not in posture, but in presence, like a layer had been removed that no one had realized was there. He pulled a small badge from beneath the fabric, simple, clean, official, and placed it gently on the counter between them, not thrown, not forced, just set down with quiet finality. The logo was unmistakable. The name beneath it even more so, Marcus Reed. The shift in the room was immediate, not loud, but absolute, like gravity had changed direction. The cashier froze mid-motion, the security guards straightened without knowing why, and Evelyn's breath caught softly, her eyes widening as she looked from the badge to the man she had been standing beside. Daniel did not move at first, his gaze locked on the name, as if reading it again might change what it said, but it did not. Marcus did not speak right away, he let the silence carry the meaning. Let it reach every corner of the store before adding anything more. When he did speak, his voice was the same as before, calm, measured, but now it carried something deeper, something that did not need to be proven. "You said this was already reviewed," he said, not raising his voice, not accusing, just returning to the same point that had never been answered. Daniel's composure faltered in a way it had not before, not outwardly dramatic, but enough that the control he had been holding on to slipped through his fingers. He started, then stopped, the sentence unable to form under the weight of what had just been revealed. Marcus's eyes moved briefly toward Evelyn, not as a signal, not as a performance, but as recognition, then back to Daniel. "So let us review it properly," he continued, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a direction, quiet but immovable. The paper on the counter remained untouched, forgotten now, no longer carrying the authority it had just minutes ago. Evelyn's hands lowered slowly to her sides, no longer hovering, no longer reaching, her posture changing in small ways that only someone paying attention would notice, but enough to show that something inside her had shifted. Daniel swallowed, his gaze flicking once more toward the hallway, toward the place where the camera had gone dark, but this time there was nowhere for that glance to go unnoticed. Marcus stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space, allowing the truth to stand on its own without pressure, without force. The lights above held steady, the hum unchanged, but the silence beneath it had transformed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but clear, settled. Like the moment after something hidden has finally been brought into the open and can no longer be pushed back into shadow. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because there was nothing left to hide behind, no procedure, no tone, no authority strong enough to reshape what had already settled into the room. Daniel stood still, his eyes no longer moving with control but searching for something that was no longer there, and slowly, almost reluctantly, his hand lifted from the counter, leaving the paper behind as if it no longer belonged to him. Marcus did not rush the moment, he did not step forward again, he simply watched, giving space for the truth to complete itself without interruption. "The inventory logs," Marcus said after a few seconds, his voice steady, calm. "Pull them up." And this time the words were not met with resistance, only hesitation. Daniel turned toward the monitor, his movements slower now, less certain, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before finally pressing a sequence that brought up the internal records. The screen flickered once, then filled with lines of data. Timestamps, item codes, movements recorded in quiet detail that did not rely on memory or explanation. Marcus stepped closer, not to take control, but to stand where the information could be seen clearly, his eyes scanning without urgency, each detail falling into place with the same calm precision that had carried him from the start. Evelyn stood a few feet behind him, her hands resting at her sides, no longer shaking. Her posture still guarded but no longer folded inward, as if something inside her had begun to unfold for the first time in a long while. The numbers told a different story, one that did not match the accusation, one that showed adjustments made after the camera went dark, entries that did not align with the timing Daniel had described, and Marcus let the silence return again, not empty, but full of what the screen now revealed. Daniel stared at it, his face tightening, then softening, then tightening again, the realization settling in waves he could not control. "I was going to fix it," he said quietly, almost to himself, the first honest sentence he had spoken, and it did not defend, it exposed. Marcus did not respond to the explanation, he did not need to, because the truth no longer required confirmation. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to look back at Evelyn, and for a brief moment the noise of the store faded behind that single connection, her eyes meeting his with something new, not fear, not relief fully, but recognition that she had been seen, truly seen, when it mattered most. Marcus reached down and slid the unsigned paper gently aside, not tearing it, not dismissing it harshly, just removing it from the center of the moment where it no longer belonged. "You will not sign that," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than any command. Evelyn nodded once, small, almost fragile, but steady. The lights above continued their soft hum, the same as before, the floor still reflected the same pale glow, but everything in the room had changed. Marcus picked up his badge from the counter, not putting it away immediately, just holding it for a second as if deciding something, then turning toward the front of the store. He did not make a speech, did not announce consequences, did not fill the space with explanations. He simply walked, each step measured, calm, toward the exit. Behind him, the room remained still, but no longer frozen, no longer silent in the same way. Something had shifted that would not shift back, and as Marcus reached the door, the glass catching a faint reflection of the store behind him, he paused for just a moment, not turning around, not speaking, then stepped outside into the open air, leaving behind a space where the truth had finally been allowed to exist without being forced back into the shadows.